The woman who handed me that mop never asked my name. She didn't need to. In her mind, she'd already decided exactly who I was. And she was about to be wrong in a way that would cost her everything. 3 hours later, I was still holding that mop, standing 3 feet from 300 of the wealthiest people in the city. I listened to them say things out loud. They would have paid a lot of money to take back if they'd known who was actually in the room. But none of them did, not one. Here's what none of them knew. I wasn't the help. I was the man whose signature was on the checks that paid for the ballroom, the champagne, the string quartet, and every single one of their salaries. And by the time the sun came up the next morning, that would no longer be a secret. It started with an email sent at 11:47 p.m. The venue coordinator for the Whitfield Foundation Gala had quit unexpectedly, and someone from the family needed to step in for setup before the event staff arrived. I didn't think twice. I've run this foundation quietly behind the scenes for 6 years. If something needed doing, I did it myself, the same way I always have, since the early days when Elena and I couldn't afford to hire anyone at all. What I didn't know was that my wife's assistant, a sharp-tongued young woman named Madison, had already decided what kind of night this was going to be, and I wasn't part of her plans. I'm not just Elena Whitfield's husband. I'm the majority shareholder of Whitfield Industries, and I built this foundation from nothing, using my grandmother's inheritance. Years before Elena and I even met. Almost no one at these events knows that, and I've never rushed to correct them. I like listening to how people talk when they think no one who matters is in the room. Elena always called my quietness a strength. Madison apparently called it something else. When I showed up early that morning in a plain black shirt, no watch and my sleeves already rolled to the elbow, Madison took one look at me and made her decision. "You're the extra help, right? Kitchen's through there. We're short-staffed, and the floors need mopping before guests arrive." I could have corrected her in that exact second. One sentence, "I'm Daniel Whitfield," is all it would have taken. The room would have shifted instantly, the way rooms always do once they learn who's actually holding the leash. But I didn't say it. That decision, the 10 seconds it took me not to speak, is the only reason any of what happened next was possible. "Of course," I said. "Happy to help." She didn't know she'd just handed me the best seat in the house. For the next 2 hours, I mopped floors, refilled ice buckets, and wiped down tables while 300 of the wealthiest people in the city walked past me, without a second glance. Nobody held a door. Nobody said thank you. A few looked straight through me the way you look through a lamp or a coat. Rack, present, useful, invisible. And I heard almost everything. I heard Richard Coyne, our head of logistics, laughing with a vendor about how he'd been padding shipping invoices for 18 months because nobody upstairs had noticed. He said it lightly, like a joke between friends, as if the money he was quietly siphoning off didn't belong to people who'd trusted him with it. Then I heard 2 board members near the auction table, men I'd personally fought to keep on staff during a rough quarter, when half the room wanted them gone. They were talking about Elena like she was a rumor instead of a person. "She's lucky," one of them said. "She married competence." The other laughed. "I've heard Daniel's the one who actually keeps this place running." Probably true. So why isn't he the face of it? A shrug. Who knows? Maybe he likes it this way. I stood there gripping the mop, almost smiling. Nobody was stopping me from running my company. I already was, quietly, exactly the way I'd always chosen to. Madison found me twice more that night, her voice a little sharper each time. "You're behind. The hallway still has footprints." Then later, without looking up from her tablet, "Try to keep up. This isn't complicated." It wasn't cruelty exactly. Nothing I could point to and call unkind. It was quieter than that. It was the tone of someone who'd already decided my place in the room and didn't think it was worth revisiting. Open disrespect is easy to challenge because it announces itself. This was something else. The kind of indifference that doesn't need to raise its voice because it's already made up its mind about you. At 9:40 p.m., Elena took the stage. I watched from near the kitchen doors, mop still in hand, as my wife thanked the donors, the board, and the staff who worked tirelessly behind the scenes. She didn't see me. Nobody did. I'd spent 6 years relying on reports and audits to tell me how this company actually ran, but that night taught me something a spreadsheet never could. Paper tells you what people do. Standing where no one thinks to look tells you who they are. Then she said the line that made me smile for the first time all evening. And of course, none of this would exist without my husband, Daniel, who I know is somewhere in this room right now, probably making sure everything runs smoother than I ever could. Warm laughter rolled through the ballroom. Heads turned toward the stage and toward the VIP tables, searching for a man in a sharp suit with a drink in his hand. Not one of them looked toward the kitchen doors. I let it stay that way for another hour, not to prove a point and not to embarrass anyone. I stayed because every extra minute answered a question I'd been carrying for years without realizing it. Who are people really when they're sure no one important is watching? Around 10:30, Madison cornered me by the coat check, annoyed that a spill hadn't been handled fast enough. "I don't know who approved you for tonight," she said, arms folded. "But high-profile events move fast. We need people who can actually keep up. I'll be speaking with the events director. We won't be asking you back." I just looked at her for a second, not with anger, barely even surprise, just a kind of quiet curiosity, because she clearly believed she was protecting something. "You should tell her," I said. "I'd be interested to hear what she says." She scoffed and walked off toward the stage, where Elena was still laughing with a cluster of donors, and that's when I knew the night was over. I set the mop against the wall, straightened my sleeves, and walked toward the stage area, not through the crowd, but along the staff path at the side. Marcus, Elena's longtime assistant, saw me first. I watched his expression go from confusion to something close to panic. "Mr. Whitfield, I had no idea you were already here if I'd known." "It's all right, Marcus," I said. "Where's Madison?" She was a few feet away, champagne glass in hand, laughing at something a vendor had said. I walked right over. "Madison, I wanted to thank you for tonight," I said. "Your instructions were very clear. I made sure every floor was spotless." Her smile faltered, polite and confused. "I'm sorry, do I—" "Daniel Whitfield," I said, extending my hand. "I believe you mentioned you'd be speaking with the events director about not asking me back. I'll take that under advisement." I've never watched color leave someone's face that fast. The glass in her hand actually trembled. Around us, conversation stopped mid-sentence. Recognition spread outward, and whispers moved through the crowd like ripples across still water. Not because anyone raised their voice, truth doesn't need volume to travel. Elena reached us a moment later, utterly lost, until Marcus quietly explained what had happened. She looked at me, then at the mop still leaning by the service hallway, and something in her expression settled into place all at once. "You let this go on for 2 hours?" she asked. "I let it happen," I said, "because I wanted to know exactly who we're dealing with. Now I do." She didn't laugh and she didn't gloat. She was quiet for a moment. Then she did something that surprised me. She asked Marcus to gather the events team right there, before the last guest left, and told the tired group, "Tonight, my husband worked this floor for 2 hours because someone decided he didn't matter. That won't happen again, not to him, and not to anyone on this team." It was short, almost businesslike, but it was the first time all night I'd watched Elena make a call that had nothing to do with appearances and everything, to do with the people standing in front of her. There was a moment, right after Madison had walked away from that coat check, when I almost let it go. I told myself she was young, ambitious in the way people are before life humbles them. But then I remembered how she'd looked at me, not with anger or even real contempt, just a flat indifference reserved for people you've already decided don't count. That flatness sat with me longer than cruelty would have. Cruelty at least admits you're real enough to be worth hurting. What she'd shown me was the casual erasure of someone she assumed would never cross her path again in any way that mattered. I thought about my mother while I stood there with that mop. She cleaned houses for 20 years, and I remember watching wealthy women speak to her exactly the way Madison had spoken to me, quick-clipped, already looking past her before the sentence even finished. She never complained about it. She'd just come home, take off her shoes and say, "Some people only know how to see what's useful to them." I used to think she was softening something harder underneath. Standing in that ballroom wearing someone else's assumptions, I finally understood she'd just been telling me the plain truth, as gently as she knew how. The next morning wasn't about revenge. I made sure of that on purpose. I sat down with our head of HR over coffee and laid out 3 things calmly. First, Richard Coyne's invoices would be audited immediately. With no warning given beforehand, facts speak clearly when nobody has time to rearrange them first. Second, the board minutes from the last several meetings would be reviewed before the next election cycle, because leadership isn't only measured in results. And finally, Madison would be let go by the end of the week. It wasn't for one mistaken assumption, but for a pattern I'd watched unfold over an entire evening. People who treat someone with quiet contempt when no one important is watching tend to do it again. Eventually, that attitude reaches everyone: staff, donors, clients, and even the man holding the mop. 3 days later, an email from Madison showed up in my inbox. Longer than it needed to be. She apologized, explained the pressure she'd been under, admitted she'd judged me by my clothes, and asked for another chance. I read every line, then I archived it without replying. It wasn't because I couldn't forgive her, but because some lessons only take root after you've lived inside the consequences for a while. Silence said everything I needed it to. A few evenings later, Helena and I were sitting on the back porch as the sun dropped behind the trees. She finally asked the question she'd been sitting on all week. "What stopped you from just telling her who you were the second she handed you that mop?" "Because anyone can be decent to someone they think has power," I said. I wanted to know who she'd be to someone she thought had none. That's the only version of a person that isn't rehearsed. She was quiet for a while. "Then does it ever bother you, being the one nobody notices?" "It used to," I admitted. Early on, I hated walking into rooms where I was just Elena's husband. Near the appetizers, waiting for someone to introduce me. But somewhere along the way, I stopped hearing that as an insult. I see this company more clearly than most people with a title ever will. Precisely because half the room never bothers performing for me. Being overlooked turned out to be the best education I ever got. The mop is still in that closet at the venue, as far as I know. It's not there as a trophy, just a reminder of how easily a person gets filed under furniture by someone in a hurry, and how much more that filing says about the one doing the sorting than the one being sorted. A few weeks later, I walked past that same coat check on my way to a board meeting held at the same venue. The new events coordinator, a calm, efficient woman named Teresa, was double-checking place cards against a clipboard. She looked up and smiled. "Mr. Whitfield, we've got your usual seat at the head table," and I moved the Coyne family further from the stage, per the new list. No assumptions, no performance, just simple professionalism. I thanked her and glanced, almost out of habit, toward the spot by the service hallway, where a mop had once leaned against the marble. It didn't sting the way I might have expected. It just felt clear, like something I'd needed to see plainly, once before I could stop wondering about it. If there's one thing that night confirmed for me, it's this. Watch how people treat you when they're sure you have nothing to offer them. That's not a lapse in who they are. That is exactly who they are, without an audience to perform for. Everything else, the titles, the handshakes, the polite smiles traded across a ballroom, is just the costume people wear until they think no one important is watching.